Moving into the third portion of lecture 15, we're going to talk about the neural pathways involved for the somatic motor system. So let's quickly remind ourselves of the areas of the brain that were involved. So first of all, that prefrontal cortex is deciding what we're going to do. The posterior parietal cortex is going to help us know where things are located so that we can plan things out. Our motor association cortexes are going to make the plan. What's the sequence of actions? What's the sequence of muscle contractions that will result in the actions that we want to do? And then the primary motor cortex here in that precentral gyrus is going to actually send the impulses down and out to the body to make those muscle contractions happen. Then, of course, we have the basal ganglia here, which are going to help with coordination, but tonically at baseline are inhibiting things. And then we also have the cerebellum, which is receiving all of those crazy inputs from lots of sensory systems, as well as from the motor cortex as to what the plan is, as well as up from the spinal cord as to what neurons were actually firing and what was actually happening. So the primary motor cortex is where we're going to find the upper motor neurons. I mentioned that earlier. So the upper motor neurons are in the primary motor cortex, and then their axons have to travel down to whatever level of the body these movements are going to happen. So those axons are going to travel through either the brainstem or down through the spinal cord, depending on where we're headed. So let's take a look at those pathways. First up is the corticobulbar tract. So cortico meaning it's coming from the cortex, bulbar brainstem, okay? So this corticobulbar tract, which you can see in this diagram here, is composed of the axons of these upper motor neurons that are located in the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe. So those axons are then traveling down, and then they're going to reach a motor nucleus for a specific cranial nerve, because these are the axons that are going to trigger movements of muscles in the face and the head, and sometimes the upper neck as well. So they are going to synapse with what's called a lower motor neuron. So let me underline that, a lower motor neuron in this motor nucleus. So think of it kind of like a ganglion. And then that's going to send out an impulse to the actual muscle to cause it to contract. So the corticobulbar tract is what we use for the face and head. And of course, then these signals are traveling out through the cranial nerves. Now, those motor nuclei are going to be specific for the different cranial nerves. And then the axons of those lower motor neurons, as they travel out to a certain part of the face or the head, are traveling through those cranial nerves, because remember, nerves are just bundles of axons traveling together. So this is a great time to remind ourselves of the cranial nerves. Now, not all of the cranial nerves that have motor function actually are served by the corticobulbar tract, because some of them are too far anterior and they've kind of got their own thing. So the ones involved with the eyes, so the oculomotor nerve that does lots of things in the eyes, both internally and some of the extraocular muscles, as well as the trochlear and the abducens that just do extraocular muscles, they don't travel through the corticobulbar tract. They're too far anterior in the brain, like, no. But the other cranial nerves that have motor function do. So let's remind ourselves. Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal, is primarily concerned with sensation to the face. Remember trigeminal neuralgia, but it also sends the motor impulses for the muscles of mastication, which is chewing. So that masseter muscle that moves your jaw, for example. The facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, is all about the muscles of facial expression. So remember Bell's palsy, where you get a cranial nerve palsy, facial nerve palsy. But then, of course, remember it's a mixed nerve, so you also get sensation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue through the facial nerve. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, is important for the muscles of swallowing. That's that pharyngeal component of that nerve. The glosso, which refers to the tongue, is the taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Cranial nerve number 10. We haven't talked about its motor function yet. That's going to be when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. But you may remember just last week we talked about how it gets sensory input from the gastrointestinal tract, which is part of the vomiting center, and also taste from the pharynx when we talked about taste. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory nerve. It's a motor nerve only, so it does the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid muscles. And then cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve, so muscles of the tongue. So that one's also just a motor nerve. So all of those cranial nerves, the axons from their upper motor neuron in the cerebral cortex down to the lower motor neuron are traveling through that corticobulbar tract that we saw previously. So what about for the rest of the body? So not just the head and the neck, but the whole rest of the body. So we have up in the primary motor cortex, the upper motor neurons. Those axons are going to descend down out of the brain through the midbrain. So this whole region here is the brainstem, right? Through the midbrain into the medulla, through structures that are called the pyramids. And then they decussate, they cross to the other side, and then descend down through the spinal cord through what is called the lateral corticospinal tract, because they're in those lateral columns. Remember, the columns that we see in the spinal cord are white. They're made of white matter because it's myelinated axons. So here come those upper motor neuron axons traveling down through the lateral corticospinal tract until they get to the level of wherever the muscle is. So if it's a muscle in my upper extremity, then I know I'm going to come out somewhere where I get into that brachial plexus, yes? So somewhere in the cervical spinal cord, then I'm going to synapse right here with what is called the lower motor neuron, which is located in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So remember, the ventral horn is part of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and that's where we see the motor neuron cell bodies living. So that's your lower motor neuron. And then that lower motor neuron is going to send its axon out through the ventral root and then into a spinal nerve to get to the muscle. So here's a good opportunity to just remind ourselves of upper motor neuron versus lower motor neuron. Your upper motor neuron is located in the cerebral cortex, and then it's going to send its axons down either through the corticobulbar tract or the lateral corticospinal tract, or as you can see here, there's also an anterior corticospinal tract. But so their upper motor neuron is up in the brain, and then it's going to send its axon down and synapse with a lower motor neuron that's either located in the spinal cord, and here you can see it in that ventral horn, or in the brainstem in the case of the cranial nerves. It is the lower motor neurons then that directly signal the muscles. So that lower motor neuron, its axon is going to travel out, either out from the brainstem via cranial nerves or out from the spinal cord via spinal nerves, all the way to whichever muscle it's going to signal, right? So all the way. So some of those axons are really long. So the axon that's going to tell my big toe to bend, that one is 3 feet long because the cell body of that lower motor neuron is sitting in my spinal cord, and then that axon has to travel all the way down my entire lower extremity to get to those muscles. So pretty amazing. And what I like about this diagram here is we've got our upper motor neurons up here. Here's a lower motor neuron for the head and neck. So this right here would be the corticobulbar tract. And then here is, they kind of broke out the spinal cord in a weird way. Here's the lower motor neuron from something that came down through the lateral corticospinal tract. And then it's going to send its axon out directly to the muscle. So the lower motor neuron axons then are traveling through those peripheral nerves that we learned about. So the major ones for the upper extremity that I'm expecting you to know are the median, the ulnar, and the radial nerves. So median nerve is going to supply a lot of, you can't see, a lot of the flexors in the upper extremity, a lot of the flexors, and the ulnar nerve is going to supply some of the muscles over here, and then the radial nerve is going to supply a lot of muscles on the posterior aspect. So a lot of the extensor muscles of the upper extremity are supplied by the radial nerve. In the lower extremity, you may recall we have the obturator nerve, which is here and supplies the medial thigh. We actually have a lot of muscles on the inner thigh, so it's going to supply those. Then we have the femoral nerve. Sorry, I didn't do a good job there, which is going to, that's this one here, which is supplying the anterior thigh, so your quadriceps muscles, which we learned about as being important for the patellar or knee jerk reflex. And then finally, we have the sciatic nerve, the big kahuna here, which supplies the entire posterior thigh, as well as everything from the knee down is a branch off of the sciatic nerve. So those lower motor neuron axons are traveling through these nerves. Remember, these nerves are all mixed nerves. They've got sensory fibers that are moving into the spinal cord. They have motor fibers that are coming out. Fibers just means axons, right? So that's how we're getting to the muscles. So in summary, for our neural pathways, we have the cortico-bulbar tract for movement of muscles in the head and neck. So that's carrying the axons from the upper motor neuron down to those nuclei where they're going to synapse with a lower motor neuron somewhere in the brainstem, and then those axons are going to travel out through the cranial nerves. So cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are all going to, their upper motor neuron axons travel in the cortico-bulbar tract. And then for most of the rest of the body, we're going to use the lateral corticospinal tract. I didn't break down that word. Cortico meaning cortex, spinal meaning spinal cord, right? So this is the one that goes from up here down into the spinal cord. So those axons of the upper motor neurons that need to get down to the body are going to come down through the brainstem. They decussate, they cross over in the medulla, and then travel down through that lateral column. That's where the lateral comes from. Then they're going to synapse with the lower motor neuron, which is located in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, which is then going to send its axon out through the ventral root, spinal nerve, and then those spinal nerves are going to branch into the peripheral nerves of the body. So for upper extremity, I want you to know the radial, ulnar, and median nerves, and for lower extremity, the femoral, obturator, and sciatic. So that's it for 15C.